Hello, everyone. Hope you're having a good evening so far. Welcome to Novara Live. My name's Stephen Methven. And now later in the show, I'm going to be joined by Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG. But coming up tonight, we have a pretty fantastic interview, I think, with Anatol Lieven on the current state of the Russia-Ukraine war. Hamas agrees to follow through with planned prisoner releases this weekend. And Starmer gets chased away from a housing development by a bunch of angry farmers. US President Donald Trump has begun what he calls the process of ending the war in Ukraine. And it started with a telephone call to Russian President Vladimir Putin. This is Trump giving some of the details of that call during an Oval Office press conference last night.
We had a great call, and it lasted for a long time, over an hour this morning. I also had with President Zelensky a very good call after that. And I think we're on the way to getting peace. I think President Putin wants peace, and President Zelensky wants peace, and I want peace. I just want to see people stop getting killed.
In a post on Truth Social, Trump also said that he and Putin had agreed to begin peace negotiations immediately. And in that post, Trump also made reference to the call he made to Prime Minister Volodymyr Zelensky. The call he made really just to let him know that the peace talks would be taking place. So a courtesy call, essentially, without any guarantee of a place for Ukraine's leader at the table. In that press conference, Trump signaled even more clearly that Ukraine's leadership was unlikely to have much of a say.
Do you view Ukraine as an equal member of this peace process?
It's an interesting question. I think they have to make peace. Their people are being killed, and I think they have to make peace. I said that was not a good war to go into, and I think they have to make peace. That's what I think.
Now, Trump also confirmed in that press conference that he and Putin were likely to meet soon, possibly in Saudi Arabia. Interestingly, China entered the chat today too, offering to host the Trump-Putin peace talk. Now, Trump's announcement took place in the context of his Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth meeting with NATO leaders yesterday. In that meeting, Hegseth made clear that NATO membership for Ukraine would not be part of any peace deal with Russia. And he added that Ukraine would have to cede territory to Russia in exchange for peace, calling a return to the country's pre-2014 borders a, quote, unrealistic objective. That is, at a minimum, a reference to Russia's 2014 annexation of the Crimean Peninsula. But Russian troops currently occupy a wide band of territory along Ukraine's eastern border, constituting most of the Donbass. And the fate of that territory remains in question. In his press conference, Trump was asked whether agreeing to Russian demands around Ukraine's borders and denying NATO membership to the country was essentially handing Russia victory in the war. And this was his response.
Well, I think that if you look at the war, the way the war is going, you'll have to make your own determination. I'm just here to try and get peace. I don't care so much about anything other than I want to stop having millions of people killed. Last night, Kiev got hit very, very hard. I want to see people stop getting killed. That war is ridiculous. It should have never happened, and it would have never happened.
Now, one key feature of Trump's presidency so far, both at home and abroad, has been the idea that the US is being taken for a ride by its allies and trading partners. The European Union has been especially targeted as a culprit in Trump's eyes. But Ukraine hasn't escaped either. On Wednesday, Trump cancelled the country's exemption from the 25% tariffs he's recently imposed on steel and aluminium exports to the US. Trump's administration has also been pursuing a return on the military aid given to Ukraine under the Biden administration, something Trump raised in that press conference.
Would you support Zelensky ceding territory or exchanging territory in any agreement to end the war?
Well, he's going to have to do what he has to do, but, his poll numbers aren't particularly great, to put it mildly. He's got a country where, it's been savaged and attacked, and he's got an army that's been very, very brave, actually, despite the fact that, we've given him, in my opinion, $350 billion. That's what the real number is. You don't hear that number. And Europe has given, in my opinion, $100 billion. And they've done it in the form of a loan. And I have a Secretary of Treasury right now who's actually quite brave. He's over in Ukraine on a train. And there's a lot of things happening around that train that aren't so good. And he's going there to get a document done where we're going to be assured that we're going to, in some form, get this money back because we're putting up far more money than Europe, and Europe is in far more danger than we are. We have an ocean in between. Europe has nothing in between. You know what they have in between? They have Ukraine in between. So we're getting security on our money. We're going to have it secured by, they have rare earth, and they have oil and gas, and they have a lot of other things. And we're asking for security on our money.
The way things currently stand, Ukraine appears to have been sidelined, though perhaps with the prospect of greater US support in exchange for mineral rights in the country. As ever with Trump, it's pretty unclear whether we're seeing hard bargaining in favor of US economic interests, genuine preparedness to agree to a division of Ukraine, or both. But Trump's call to Zelensky did take place, with the Ukrainian leader describing it like this.
We discussed many issues, and President Trump informed me of what Putin told him. We believe that America's strength is enough, together with us, to pressure Russia and Putin towards peace.
Zelensky is set to meet US Vice President J.D. Vance, an arch skeptic about US foreign involvement, at a defense summit in Munich on Friday. Ahead of that meeting, Zelensky had some tougher words for the US today. We cannot accept it as an independent country, any agreements made without us. I articulate this very clearly to our partners. Any bilateral negotiations about Ukraine, not on other topics, but any bilateral talks about Ukraine without us, we will not accept. Now, European leaders have expressed grave concern over Trump's plans. The Weimar Group of Germany, France, the UK, Poland, Italy, and Spain issued this statement. We are ready to enhance our support for Ukraine. We commit to its independent sovereignty and territorial integrity in the face of Russia's war of aggression. We share the goal to keep supporting Ukraine until a just, comprehensive, and lasting peace is reached, a peace that guarantees the interests of Ukraine and our own. We're looking forward to discussing the way ahead together with our American allies. Our shared objectives should be to put Ukraine in a position of strength. Ukraine and Europe must be part of any negotiations. Ukraine should be provided with strong security guarantees. A just and lasting peace in Ukraine is a necessary condition for a strong transatlantic security. We recall that the security of the European continent is our common responsibility. We are therefore working together to strengthen our collective defense capabilities. Poland's foreign minister had this to say about Trump's moves. Poland will unwaveringly seek intensified military support for Ukraine. The reinforcement of Ukraine capabilities before potential discussions with Russia is crucial for our continent. And France's foreign minister stressed how important he believes NATO membership for Ukraine is, saying this: "We are very attached to a pathway for Ukraine towards NATO. If there is a peace, we need security guarantees so that it is fair and lasting. It's European security that is at stake with this war of aggression. That has upset the world order and means we cannot return to the world before the invasion." Finally, this was the UK's Defence Minister John Healey speaking from a NATO meeting in Brussels.
We all want to see a durable peace and no return to conflict and aggression. And let's not forget, Russia remains a threat well beyond Ukraine. So my message in these discussions will be that there can be no negotiation about Ukraine without Ukraine, and Ukraine's voice must be at the heart of any talks.
The chair of Russia's Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, had his own diagnosis of what Trump's moves reveal about Europe. Claiming, perhaps correctly, that Europe hadn't been warned in advance of Trump's call with Putin, Medvedev said this on Telegram: "Frigid spinster Europe is mad with jealousy and rage. It shows its real role in the world. Europe's time is over." Now, Reuters has asked Ukrainians in Kyiv what they thought of the development. Here's what some of them said.
I find it difficult to understand why anyone would take the first call, a call to a president of a country that has attacked another country, a president who is a terrorist, and only after that talk to a president of a country that has to defend itself. It is a very surprising decision made by President Trump, very strange. I do not want to see everything in black, as they say, but it looks like Ukraine has been betrayed. In what is being said now, in all the rhetoric, I do not see anything good for Ukraine. This is very sad.
It is so difficult, I do not even know what to say. I think we should not wait. We need to build our own strong military force instead. All those promises, it is like a man proposing to marry a girl and then changing his mind. We have to build a strong state and a strong army so that we would not have to rely on anyone.
Ordinary Ukrainians, like those two that you saw there, have been at the heart of this war for nearly 3 years, with families split up as nearly 7 million refugees, mostly women and children, fled the violence. Left behind were husbands, fathers, and sons, many of them now killed. Trump's move towards a more conciliatory position with Russia must seem, to many of them, a betrayal and even an abandonment. But there's also a view that Trump's actions show something about the kind of war this has been all along. On the face of it, Trump appears to have made an explicit return to big imperial politics. We're seeing two world powers beginning the process of agreeing the map and future of a third country, Ukraine, with smaller powers like the UK, France, and Germany scrambling for a seat at the table. Now, this also seems to mirror an analysis of the war that many have given from the beginning, casting the invasion of Ukraine as essentially a proxy for a wider battle between global powers. Earlier today, I spoke with Anatol Lieven, Senior Fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and I began by asking him whether Trump's latest moves add support to that view.
What Trump has essentially done is to tear off the mask, if you will, of US imperialism, and simply bring out into the open what you didn't really need to dig very far to find, which is that the US pursues its own interests, which it defines, and it expects its allies to follow it. When Biden was elected, he emphasized that America was returning to the international table, but he said to the head of the table. There was no question of America deferring to other countries, or following an international consensus with which it disagreed. So in that sense, Trump, I think, has simply been more honest. But the other thing, of course, about Trump is that while he is an imperialist, he is defining American imperial interests in significantly different ways. Clearly, he is trying to reduce US commitments in Europe. He has made some, quite extraordinary suggestions about deeper engagement in the Middle East, though we have to see whether, that is actually serious. Many of his people, want to expand US power vis-a-vis China. But above all, of course, Trump has done something or done it in a new way, which has been really, not shelved. It was always there in the background, but certainly not brought into the foreground by recent American administrations, which is a new and very hard version of the Monroe Doctrine, in which America is absolutely categorically dominant in its own continent, and even perhaps is going to expand its territory on its continent. Well, now, that is a fascinating move because, if we are going back to 19th century imperialism, of course, none of the 19th century empires expected to get their way everywhere. There were numerous territorial compromises between them, which in a way is what Trump appears to be trying to do with Russia. But the other thing, of course, is that, look, of course, the Democrats can win in 2028, but I think it will be very difficult after this for America to present itself in the old way as, a unique moral superpower. If, in fact, it is absolutely obviously behaving like the other superpowers.
One feature of Trump's administration so far, which is incredibly young administration, although of course we had the first one to look back to as well, has been really to give up on the idea of soft power in exchange for flexing the actual hard power that it has. And in that the press conference that he gave in the Oval Office last night, he talked a lot about actually getting a return on US military investment in Ukraine. So he talked about minerals, gas, and oil. I think the figure that's been floated around is something to the tune of $500 billion expected in return for the military defense investment that has been made in Ukraine. So do you think that there is something gestural in what's happening here? I mean, with Trump, you've always got to remember he's a businessman, the art of negotiation, and so on and so forth. Is this a negotiating chip, or do you think this is actually a real move towards multipolarity?
I mean, multipolarity has been used, as in so many different ways that it's difficult to say exactly what it means. Sometimes it's just, to describe America trying to act through its alliances when possible, though successive democratic administrations have been willing to act outside those alliances if the alliances wouldn't go along with them. At other times, multipolarity, for example, in the area of climate change, has involved genuine negotiation with other powers. And so we have to see what this will mean in terms of future American policy. But I mean, the other point, though, is that multipolarity is, of course, not an ideology as such, though it has ideological elements. But if you look at the way it's regarded by somebody like Pete Hegseth, for example, it's also simply a recognition of reality. There are different centers of power, and in their own areas, there are limits to what America can do. Certainly, if America is not willing, actually to intervene directly itself on the ground, it was always clear that, as Obama himself said, by the way, that because Russia is there and because Russia has much deeper interests in Ukraine, Russia would have the edge over the West in Ukraine, which is how it has turned out.
So let's talk about what you think is going to happen next. So the idea is that Putin and Trump will meet. I see today China has volunteered to host that meeting, although Trump last night talked about having it in Saudi Arabia. Zelensky appears to have been sidelined entirely, just given a sort of courtesy call to let him know that it's happening. European leaders also appear to have been blindsided by this announcement with a flurry of activity today. Does that tell you anything about the nature of the negotiations that are about to take place and what the end result could be for Ukraine as well as for Europe?
The basic terms of this, assuming that Trump is not simply going to give in to Russian demands, are that America should act to accommodate some of Russia's key wider security concerns about Russia's position in Europe, about threats to Russia. And in return, Russia should basically call off its modestly successful offensive against Ukraine and to basically call off the war and abandon its maximalist demands vis-a-vis Ukraine. And because when it comes to these wider issues, Trump and Hegseth are basically right. And I've been writing this for a long time, as has my institute and my colleagues. Issues like NATO membership, this has been presented as an issue for Ukraine. It isn't. Ukraine does not decide whether or not it's going to be a member of NATO. Existing NATO members, led by the United States, do. And by the way, and here once again, Hegseth has simply recognized reality, there was no way that Ukraine was ever going to be a member of NATO, both because every NATO country had said repeatedly it would not go to war to defend Ukraine, which is what Article 5 is. But also, it only takes one veto to block new membership, a new member from joining NATO. And it's absolutely clear Hungary would veto, Slovakia would veto. Not just that, but all the odds are that in 2027, Marine Le Pen, or one of her people, will be elected president of France. So France will veto. So it was never going to happen. But clearly, this had to be nailed down with the Russians and US arms supplies to Ukraine. That's also something for the US to decide, not for Ukraine to decide. Arms limitations in Europe, which obviously would have to be mutual, but that is first and foremost an issue for the United States. Do not please let us forget that all the serious arms negotiations with the Soviet Union and then Russia were basically conducted by the United States. And Europeans had a walk-on role. In the past, there was some effort, though not under the Bush administration, by the way, to pretend that the Europeans had a significant role. But now Trump has dropped the pretense. Of course, sorry, to come back to a previous question, there is also the issue of, whether, as he clearly now is trying to, Zelensky can gain more support from Trump by basically offering him the Ukrainian economy. We'll have to see just how tempted Trump is by that. Has to be said, America has given something, I think, altogether in the region of $168 billion in aid to Ukraine. If America got $500 billion back, that'd be a nice margin of profit by anybody's standards.
Let's just talk about the spectre of further Russian involvement or Russian expansion into Europe. This is obviously something that makes Eastern European countries very anxious. I noticed this morning that in the Polish press, there's quite a lot of comparison to Sudetenland. Now, obviously, that sort of historical reference has a political purpose. But even in Western Europe, people have been talking about the fact that Russia actually would like to dominate or move further into Europe. What do you think of those remarks? Are they merely political remarks, or is there actually a threat, a genuine threat embedded in them?
I don't believe that there is. The Russian government has never threatened to attack Poland. It hasn't actually even threatened to attack the Baltic states, unless, of course, NATO itself had joined in the war in Ukraine, in which case there would be a war between NATO and Russia. And then, of course, then there would have been war everywhere. But a lot of the Western analysis of this has fallen into, deep cognitive dissonance, because on the one hand, we've been told that, Putin has a particular obsession with Ukraine, thinks that the Ukrainians and Russians are one people, thinks that large areas of Ukraine are historically Russian. And then on the other hand, we're told that, Putin wants to attack Poland and dominate the whole of Europe. No Russian thinks that the Poles are one people with the Russians. And there is there is nothing that Russia could gain from an attack, a direct attack on NATO, that could possibly justify the risks involved. Quite apart from the risk of nuclear war, and even Trump could not stand by if Russia actually invaded NATO. There is also simply the point that it's very funny. We've over the past 2 years has been very like the Western Front. The Western media has described Russians capturing cities like Kharkov, or Bakhmut. Now, when I was traveling as a journalist in that part of the world, I drove through these places without noticing. This is like Passchendaele or Bapaume or Langemarck in the First World War, villages that nobody had ever heard of, suddenly supposedly became huge, military targets. Look, the fact of the matter is that if, at the present rate, it would take Russia more than a year just to conquer the whole of the Donbass from Ukraine. Now, does that indicate a country which is in the position of being able to march into Warsaw? Let's please be a little bit serious about this. No, I mean, the Russian threats to Europe have been an effort to dissuade the Europeans from intervening in Ukraine, and to that extent have, I think, been successful. Now, more widely, I mean, all this talk of Yalta is rubbish. Yalta was not about Ukraine. Nobody remotely raised the idea of Ukraine not being under Russia in 1945. In fact, the only person who'd done that in the previous few years was a gentleman called Hitler. No, I mean, it was about the extent to which the Soviet Union would dominate countries in Eastern Europe, which, by the way, of course, you have to remember, it had already, to a considerable extent, occupied. Not Eastern Germany yet, but most of Poland, Hungary, Romania. Now, that's not on the cards today. America could not give Poland or Romania to Russia, even if it wanted to. The Russian army is not there. The Russian army cannot get there. There are no communist parties in these countries which wish to identify with Moscow and come under Moscow's rule. I mean, this is like these endless references to Munich. I mean, this is an example of a combination of paranoids and ignoramuses, plucking individual examples from history to make a propagandist point. It's in no sense serious analysis. By the way, I mean, just to add, there has developed this syndrome in the West, which talks about the Poles and the Balts, for example, as the people who really know the Russians and really understand the Russians and what the Russians are going to do. This is exactly like if you were to treat the Guatemalans and the Cheyenne, for example, as the greatest experts on the United States and United States foreign policy. Now, I'm not saying that they don't have a legitimate point of view, but I think we'll all agree that it does have certain historical biases worked into it.
One last question, Anatol. One of the really striking things I thought in Trump's remarks in the Oval Office last night was, he really brought up just how many people have been killed in this war. He talked about the bodies of young men, that when a bullet is fired over the flat landscape of Ukraine, it doesn't stop until it hits a body. Really evocative images of the actual human cost of this war. That seems to me quite a change from the way that our leaders have talked about it, about how the Biden administration has talked about it, really, as it were, revealing that war actually does have a human cost as opposed to a merely territorial or political one. What did you make of that?
Well, I mean, I don't know how sincere this is on Trump's part. He's not exactly known as a humanitarian character. I suspect it may be more sincere on Hegseth's part because he is, after all, an ex-soldier. He knows something about this. But I would say that, yes, when it comes to this always completely empty and hypocritical fake offer of NATO membership to Ukraine, which I myself believe if we had offered a treaty of neutrality in 2021, Putin would not have invaded. He might well have tried to go on bringing certain kinds of pressure. But if we had ceded the top point in the Russian list of demands, I can't see how Putin would have been able to invade. Similarly, it's been clear since the second half of 2023 and the failure of the Ukrainian offensive that the Ukrainians were not going to be able to recover their lost territories. And yet our leaders went on and on and on, saying that the only outcome of this war must be Ukrainian victory and restoration of Ukrainian territorial integrity. And it is worth asking exactly just how many people have died, the soldiers, women, children, on both sides, of course, but especially on the Ukrainian side, how many people have died so that the West could continue to indulge itself in these illusions because our leaders did not have the moral courage to admit that they'd made a mistake and it was time to do a deal. And I really do feel that those deaths are on Putin's conscience, no question about it. And he, retains the chief responsibility for this war. But by God, our governments have something on their consciences as well.
After previously threatening to delay the scheduled release of 3 Israeli captives this Saturday due to alleged Israeli violations of the ceasefire agreement, Hamas has announced that the release will now go ahead as planned. The Israeli government had said that if the hostages were not released on schedule, it would resume its genocidal war on Gaza. Hamas say that Israel is violating the ceasefire agreement by obstructing the entry of humanitarian aid. Its officials say Israel has blocked the entry of 60,000 mobile houses and 200,000 tents, as well as heavy machinery to remove rubble and fuel. Drone footage taken before and after the war shows the extent of the devastation in Gaza and how urgently the emergency housing and equipment are needed. Under the ceasefire agreement, Israel is supposed to allow the entry of 600 aid trucks per day, but Gaza's municipality spokesperson said they'd seen only 100 to 150 per day at best, so nothing really. An official with knowledge of the ceasefire negotiations told Reuters that Israel had rejected requests by the United Nations, Qatar, and others to allow temporary housing units to be brought into Gaza to shelter displaced people, as required under the humanitarian appendix to the first phase of the ceasefire agreement. Egyptian state-run TV announced that Egypt and Qatar have resolved the dispute between Israel and Hamas, meaning the ceasefire will now continue to hold, insofar as it has been holding. But it's not yet clear precisely what has been agreed. Hamas said its delegation held talks in Cairo with Egyptian officials and was in contact with the Prime Minister of Qatar about increasing the entry of the shelters, medical supplies, fuel, and heavy equipment for clearing rubble in Gaza. Egyptian media also broadcast this footage of bulldozers and trucks carrying container houses lined up on the Egyptian side of the Rafah border crossing. They reported that the trucks were heading to an Israeli inspection area before crossing into Gaza. No information, though, was given on when the trucks and bulldozers would be allowed to enter. Meanwhile, in the West Bank, which is not covered by the ceasefire agreement, the Israeli military continues its assault on Tulkarm and Jenin. Yesterday evening, 3 Palestinians were shot dead in the Nur Shams refugee camp in Tulkarm city. The escalation in the West Bank began very shortly after the Gaza ceasefire deal was agreed on the 19th of January. Israeli forces have deployed fighter jets, armed drones, tanks, and bulldozers, causing significant destruction and displacing over 38,000 Palestinians, according to Doctors Without Borders. Israeli settler violence is an ongoing threat for Palestinians in the West Bank too, and the frequency and intensity of attacks has increased following the announcement of a ceasefire in Gaza. Today, a group of settlers stormed the agricultural village of Al-Wasaj, kidnapped a Palestinian man, and took him to an unknown location, according to the director of the Palestinian Prisoner Society, Aid Brahma. I'm now joined by Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG. Let me begin, Helena, by asking you how you are.
I'm doing very well, thank you. As always, good to be co-hosting with you today, Stephen. It's been quite a while. I think it was last year that we last shared the stage together. So good to be back.
It is last year that we last did it, and it is very good to have you back as well. Let's go on to my question to you about what's happening in Gaza. Do you think, Helena, that the ceasefire is going to hold? I mean, insofar as it has been holding already. And what do you think the longer-term prospects are for Palestinians in both Gaza and the West Bank?
So actually, the more time goes on, the more secure I am in thinking that the ceasefire probably will hold. The fact that there has been negotiations to the point at which that this issue has been able to be has been solved between Hamas and the Netanyahu administration through the mediators in Egypt and Qatar, I think that is a really promising step to see that even if there are roadblocks, these have been ironed out by any amount of mediation and negotiation that's been happening thus far. Now, of course, it does show you the terrible attitude of Israel as far as their concern for Palestinian civilians, to the point which they've been blocking things such as shelter and aid and fuel. These aren't things exactly that you would be able to, especially not the homes and the aid, like the temporary shelters. But these weren't things that Hamas would potentially use to rearm, which is clearly, if you want to take Israel's concerns that they mention seriously rather than anything that they don't say, their concern over aid getting into Gaza then could be used to help Hamas be able to recoup and rearm given the status of the ceasefire. But I find that to be quite a laughable claim that a lot of these people in the government would make. But regardless, it does show you that there's really one-sided in terms of the power arrangement here. One of the things that does make me think the ceasefire will hold, it's clear that, of course, the position that Israel has to continue what it does in Gaza is entirely at the behest of the American administration. As long as they have friends in the White House who want them to continue or are happy for them to continue engaging in their assault on the Palestinian territories, then they will continue to do that. But I think it's clear, given that Trump's plans that he seems to want to have for Gaza involve some amounts of American involvement in the area, he wouldn't want there to be a continuation himself of the conflict moving forward, even if I think his plan is bogus. And I don't think this idea that he would have of owning the territory and expelling the Palestinians, doing ethnic cleansing, is something that would happen. I think that his personal designs on what happens after the ceasefire that he essentially has arranged happens, I think that he would not be happy with there being a continuing of the offensive, as say, for example, once the full hostage exchange has been completed within these two territories. As for the long-term future for Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, the biggest problem is that I am fully of the opinion now, given what we've seen so far, that we'll almost certainly see a re-establishing of the Palestinian Authority in Gaza at this point. I think Hamas, they have said previously, and also since we've seen the agreement between the Palestinian Authority political parties and Hamas in their summit they had in China, so about 6 months ago now, that they are on a united front in terms of their position with regards to Israel in future. I think we will probably see a return of the Palestinian Authority in Gaza. And long term, this doesn't seem very good for Palestinians more broadly, because we've not really seen from the political parties and the Palestinian Authority much in terms of a response to Israel's continuing settler violence, Israel's continuing of building of outposts and new settlements that has gone completely supported by the current administration, especially the far-right elements like Ben Gvir and Smotrich, who have designs on not just the West Bank, but on mostly North Gaza as well. So any kind of future agreement which has the Palestinian Authority in Gaza, I don't think they would put up any resistance potentially to the construction of new settlements in Gaza, an undoing of the unilateral disengagement protocol that was done by Ariel Sharon in the 2000s. So I think that would be something that would happen. And the problem, of course, is if this does happen, this won't quell any amount of popular support for Palestinian resistance within the West Bank or in Gaza. That won't happen. In fact, the support for Hamas as a political entity is at its highest it's been in the West Bank for ages. Even if Hamas's own personal capacity as a militant group, as a political force, has been spent by this conflict in terms of how they're able to regroup, given that their base and their operations are within a territory that's currently being surveilled by all parties within the ceasefire agreement, there would still be other militant groups elsewhere. That's the whole, again, throughout this entirety of this conflict, throughout the entirety of the genocide, the main thing that I think the only kind of left-wing media has properly scrutinized of all of this is that there is a material basis to all of this. The material basis is Israel's occupation of Palestine. That is why there is resistance. That is why that there has been militant action. And this is why that we have seen the scenes we've seen for the last 15 months or so, and previously since 1948 and onwards. And if there will be other militant groups moving forward, if it's not Hamas, it'll be somebody else. They'll move on to a different militant group who will provide the resistance. The Palestinians collectively say that they are happy to support, at least in terms of political affiliation. And so if we really want to see a proper settlement, if we really want the end to this happen, there is one thing and one thing only that will create a proper future for Palestinians and create a proper peace in the Middle East. And that is, of course, an end to the occupation of Palestine.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting, horrifying things about Trump's plan is that it contains within it not only not the end of the occupation of part of Palestine, the Gaza Strip, but a new occupier. And I wonder, about your faith in the holding of this ceasefire. I have to say I'm less optimistic, and part of my reason for being pessimistic is that I think Trump's interventions, in a way, have completely destabilized the basis of the ceasefire. So security guarantees are supposed to be given by Qatar, Egypt, and the US. But when the US then comes along and says, well, actually, that third phase of the ceasefire, which is the reconstruction of Gaza and self-determination, that's not going to happen because we're going to relocate you or ethnically cleanse you or displace you, and we're going to take it over ourselves. Now, I know you say you don't think that's going to happen. I'd be interested to know why you think that's not going to happen, but also how it is. I mean, for myself, what I don't understand is how it is that the Palestinians can see the ceasefire as anything worthwhile, given that its primary guarantor and most powerful guarantor has sort of, rubbished it essentially.
I think that I was more pessimistic before we'd seen the conversations between the Jordanian king and Trump the other day, showing that I think most of the states who, whilst we have seen historically over the last few decades or so, a lot of the previous Arab states in the proximity of Israel essentially give up on the explicit support of Palestine and Palestinians in terms of their struggle against Israel and against the occupation. But what we have seen is that regardless of how much these political entities haven't been supportive, what they have done is they've put their foot down on the idea of Palestinian relocation and ethnic cleansing. Right? That's one thing that these people will not acquiesce to at all. There is no situation in which I think that you could get Egypt or Jordan or any other of these countries to accept this. Even if it's not in terms of their support for Palestinian self-determination, there are obviously huge political costs for the authorities in Jordan and in Egypt to bear. I think the speaker that we had yesterday from the Quincy Institute was incredibly erudite when she was pointing out that a transferal, an ethnic cleansing of Palestinians into Jordan could almost potentially double the population of Jordan. That's a gigantic taking in of new population that would be completely destabilizing and would be completely a red line for any of these states to be able to accept. Certainly the same as with Sisi as well, who was under incredible political pressure, both in terms of what's happening in Gaza and indeed in terms of their own economic problems, which would be massively impacted by an influx of people having been ethnically cleansed from the Gaza Strip. So I just don't see a political solution to any of this that can make Trump's plan real. Unless there is an actual military expulsion that forces the hands of Egypt and Jordan, which I don't think is happening. I don't think that Trump could get away with that, given his supporter base are completely against any amount of interventionist politics in terms of the military being used to do such a thing. And it would almost certainly have to be the American military that would do that for the US to be able to make the claim that Trump wants on this territory. I just don't see it as being feasible. But what I do think your point is correct on, in that there is obviously plenty of scope for Palestinians themselves to say, well, we can't trust this ceasefire at all, given the America have essentially said they want the entire territory ceded. So if that is the point that they're working from, how can we maintain at the end of the bargain that we're holding up at all? What if we can't even be expected or be given guarantees that we can actually live in our territory, live in our home, live in our homeland, live in the state that we occupy, right? Because, of course, most countries recognize Palestine as a state that they currently live in. Then what's the point in us rebuilding the area, even if it's just threadbare tents and the essentials to life, when this is something we'll never come back to once Trump's finished with? So I think that is where reasonable skepticism is allowed, whether the Palestinian side of this agreement could be likely to not hold up, could to potentially collapse due to them not having any faith at all that the mediation will continue in their favor.
Yeah, I have to agree with you on that point about other states in the Middle East. It seems to me a very striking unintended consequence of Trump's proposal that the Arab states are uniting to form potentially a bloc with a different plan, but certainly resistant to the idea of the forcible transfer of Palestinians out of Gaza. And as you say, not necessarily for humanitarian or altruistic reasons, but rather because there aren't very many domestic populations in the Middle East who would tolerate a leadership that oversaw or approved of the forced transfer of Palestinians out of their land. And we've seen, the kind of very, very diplomatic meeting, but nonetheless displaying a kind of quiet resistance between King Abdullah of Jordan. We've seen Egypt saying that they won't meet with Trump until this plan is put to bed, and also very, very and unusually vocal resistance from Saudi Arabia. So yeah, I think that there is a kind of new power shaping in the region that may who certainly Israel won't like the look of and may indeed help to shore up support for the ceasefire against Trump's proposals. So that would be the hope anyway. After a depressing run of anti-immigration interventions, Labour is attempting to claw back some progressive cred. The government has announced that more than 100 new towns are being considered under plans for, quote, the largest house building programme since the post-war era. Sounds really unlikely, doesn't it? But that number is, in fact, a bit misleading. The actual policy is that up to 12 new towns will be under construction by the next election, each with, quote, the potential for at least 10,000 new homes and accompanying infrastructure. Over 100 potential locations have been proposed by local councils, most of which are actually extensions to existing settlements rather than entirely new towns. Now, Starmer had hoped to launch the policy with a bang by visiting a new housing development in Milton Keynes. But as is becoming something of a theme for the increasingly embattled Prime Minister, things didn't quite go to plan. Shortly after he arrived at the site, a group of tractor-driving protesters descended and staged a noisy demonstration. The protesting farmers brandished Union Jacks and placards reading, "Back British Farming." And as you've just heard, they played the rude sandstorm on their tractor horns as Starmer attempted to talk with construction workers. The Prime Minister was ultimately forced to cut the visit short and was evacuated from the Milton Keynes site via helicopter. Now, the government previously promised to build 1.5 million new homes in 5 years and would need to build an average of 370,000 homes each year to meet that commitment. This new announcement of at least 10,000 new homes in each of 12 locations adds up to 120,000 new homes, and they're only promising to begin work on these developments before the next election. Earlier this week, Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner said the government is still committed to the 1.5 million target. Building Safety Minister Alex Norris also said he is, quote, absolutely confident that they'll deliver on that pledge. However, some experts have expressed doubt that 1.5 million new homes in 5 years is a realistic goal as things stand. Others have criticised the lack of specific targets for affordable and social rent homes. Here's what Chief Executive of Shelter, Polly Neate, had to say. We need bold and ambitious action to tackle the housing emergency head-on, so it's promising to see the government take steps in the right direction. For too long, housing has been neglected, under-regulated and underfunded while generation after generation face the consequences. Making sure that homes are safe and fit for the future is vital, but the government will never succeed in giving everyone a decent home until it invests in the genuinely affordable social homes this country needs. That's why it must set a clear target for social rent homes to end the housing emergency for good. Now, while Labour has promised to prioritise affordable housing, they've not promised a specific number of new affordable homes. Shelter is calling for 90,000 new social homes to be built annually. So, Helena, is the government doing enough on housing? And do you think they're going to hit anything like that 1.5 million target new homes in 5 years?
Well, the short answer is no. The short answer is I do not see any kind of situation where they would actually complete these 1.5 million homes by the end of the parliament. I don't think that's going to happen, given the current strategy they're employing. I will give them credit where credit is due, though. The New Towns plan is a good one. I was in support of it before the election when they announced it as part of their manifesto, and I am in support of it now as well. We can't just have urban sprawl forever. If we're going to create new homes, we can have well-built, well-planned new towns, similar indeed to Milton Keynes, that has one of the highest levels of resident satisfaction of any towns in the country. I know lots of people deride Milton Keynes, and the station is particularly ugly, I must say. But the people who live there are very, very satisfied with living there. And it is, again, places where those people do want to live. It's a community town. And these kind of places are things that we will need moving forward if we want to be able to have land space used in the best way possible for potential new homes. And we could create better neighbourhoods We can plan our new towns in such a way that we can have things within walking distance. We can have properly planned bus and train routes. We can create towns of the future that are planned for the necessary things that we will need to be able to hit net zero, to be able to reduce the reliance on cars, and to be able to incentivize people to be better at being pedestrians rather than using their cars over and over and over again. So there is plenty of scope. I'm not saying they'll definitely do this, but there is plenty of scope for them to use this as a way of being able to show us how we can be able to create a city planning blueprint for the future. The problem, of course, is that when it comes to their 1.5 million home target, their current plan, in terms of the vast majority of these homes, is to just deregulate the planning sector, which has been essentially their kind of main tenet of their plan for growth. Their central mission in government was to grow the economy. And one of the biggest things they have, at least what was talking about before the election, was that they'll deregulate the planning sector, we'll build some things, they're going to be the builders, not the blockers, and this will create the growth that they need to be able to have money for public spending. This is the basis of their growth plan. And this is not going to cut it. You can't just go, well, change the planning laws and then inshallah housing into existence. You have to have an actual strategy for being able to deliver this housing. And if you look at the post-war period since 1945, when was the period where we actually built enough homes that would actually hit the target of 1.5 million by building over 300,000 homes per year? The literally only time we ever hit anything close to that was when literally half of these homes were being built as council houses. This was in the post-war period from 1945 until about 1970, when this tailed off and before we started selling off council houses. This is the only working model we have previously had in creating the level of new houses necessary to solve the current housing crisis that we have. What's their current spending plans for social homes at the moment? £500 million announced in the October budget. That's like 5,000 homes. This is less than 1% of what we're going to be needing in terms of the current plan for new houses in this parliament. And it needs to be, the scale needs to be like factors of 10 more than this. Shelter say 90,000. I think that 100,000, 6 figures, should really be the number that we're aiming for. And this shouldn't be a difficult task. This shouldn't be something that is seen as being a daunting problem for the government. When we were building hundreds of thousands of council houses every single year from 1945 until 1970, right? This isn't something that is out of the ordinary. In fact, if you look at the post-war period and compare it to now, it is distinctly out of the ordinary that we don't build any social homes at all. It's completely out of the ordinary in the post-war period for us to not have this provision in terms of providing social and affordable houses for everybody, so that council housing isn't just something that is there for the desperate, for people who have no other option and you get thrust into the private rented sector. Otherwise, it should be something that you build community around the fact that you have access to council housing. In fact, it was only in 2011 that the number of private rents outstripped the number of social rents, including housing association and council properties. So again, there was a housing crisis where after we stopped building council housing, after we started selling them off, and there wasn't one before then. That seems like a correlation to me. Like, I know you can say correlation doesn't equal causation, but I don't think I'm convinced that this isn't some kind of causation that's here. And the other thing is that there's plenty of scope for the government to do this too, as it's a supply-based spending commitment. It's a spending commitment that explicitly increases the supply of houses in the economy. You can justify fiscal expansion on this. You can justify new government spending. You can government borrowing, if you want to use the term. You can justify this on an increase in supply, because that means that supply will also increase whilst demand increases, because you've started spending more money into the economy. So it wouldn't be an inflationary measure, and it would be very pro-growth to be able to do such a thing. And you could fund, say, for example, a state-owned developer that you have, so that it doesn't have to go through a million layers of judicial review in terms of whether these new towns get built or not, because it's not a private company. You can make sure that it fits the blueprint that you have for these new towns, and you don't get caught up in 1,000 different pieces of subcontraction and competing contracts and people not doing a good job, like we're seeing with HS2. If anything, you should be able to disabuse you of this idea that private companies can provide good value for the taxpayer in terms of being spent on development and civil infrastructure. HS2 should show that this is a complete non-starter because it's been a gigantic failure where costs have spiraled out of control due to competing contracts, indeed, in the private sector to be able to build different bits and pieces of HS2 from from London to Birmingham, let alone any further north. So we need a state-owned developer. We need to be building social housing. We need to use fiscal expansion for that. But if that's within the scope of new towns, then I would be all for that. The basis of the plan is something that I agree with. The execution is the problem.
I want to ask you something different, which is now like about the look and feel of all of this, or the vibe. When I was reading this story this morning, and it was like, 100 new Labour is considering 100 new towns, et cetera, I was just like, who are you kidding? Who are you kidding? Even 12 towns sounds like a stretch with this kind of, government that really is a government, it seems to be primarily of inaction. And I don't know whether I've become a bit Trump-brained by just watching so much of the man over the last few weeks, but it's like the worst luck for Keir Starmer to end up being prime minister just months before Trump comes into office. And in a matter of weeks, whether you agree with what he's doing or not, actually seems to be making things happen, ripping up rule books, et cetera, in order to remake the state and the shape that he thinks is best for it, or best for him, most profitable for him. Who knows? But stuff is getting done. Whereas like Keir Starmer gets chased away from a building site by a handful of tractors hooting their horns. Does it fill you with confidence?
I mean, I don't have any confidence in this government at all. I mean, finding something that I could be confident about, there's a very short supply in terms of this government, again, which I've mentioned plenty of times on this show, didn't have a plan. They had no plan for governance. They spent 5 years where they didn't expect to win an election, and then Liz Truss gifted them access to Downing Street 5 years earlier than they had planned. Keir Starmer was their proxy leader to be able to expunge the left from the party. And then for the next parliament, they would then be able to use that as a launch pad to be able to beat the Tories once they'd shown provable leadership in opposition, right? Wes Streeting potential figure. But no, they're here in government now, having not expected to have been. They don't have a clue what they're doing, making things up on the fly, asking the regulators for growth ideas. This is the adults in the room again. This is what grown-up politics we have been told looks like. And it is anything but. And because they don't have a plan, they don't have an ideology. Keir Starmer certainly doesn't, especially from what we've heard about people saying about him behind his back within the Labour Party. This is a man who's not of action, who's of platitudes and of pablum and of looking the part but not acting the part. And people do want to see action. I saw a Conservative MP on Politics Live yesterday, I think it was, maybe it was a couple of days ago, saying people don't want policy. I'm like, are you mad? Are you crazy? People are living in a place where things don't work. The public sector is being shredded. You can't afford to live. No one's having kids because you can't move out of your parents' house. The one thing people want is policy. People are looking at huge numbers of societal problems in this country, like a broken Britain, and they want actual concrete plans on how to solve these things. They don't want pablum. They don't want platitudes. They want action, and they want direct solutions to problems. This is why I think the rent control, it should be a popular policy that oppositions to Labour should absolutely run on, because the private rented sector is out of control right now. And this is a direct plan immediately to solve these issues for current private renters that will be politically very popular. What I would say in terms of this plan with regards to housing, if there was one member of the cabinet, even if I fundamentally dislike her for plenty of reasons internally about Labour Party politics, but I think she is somebody who speaks her mind and I think who genuinely believes in her remit, I think Angela Rayner is one of those people. Despite my disagreements with her, I tend to see her as a traitor to the left in the party. At the very least, as someone who's come from council housing, who's come from that background, she believes in this. She knows she believes in building the houses for people to live in. She knows what private renting does to people. She knows what the housing crisis looks like from the very, very front end. She's been at the sharp end of these things in her own actual life. And I think that I feel like she is genuinely very honest and sincere about the things that she says. And I think that if you were going to trust somebody to at least want to deliver these things, even if there may not be the fiscal room from above her or the level of action necessary from her superiors to be able to put that into practice, if the crux of it is whether Angela Rayner believes in it and wants to do it, I think that she would. I think she would have the personal gumption to go through with it. The problem, of course, is that she's not the one controlling the purse strings. And on that matter, I do think it's quite funny that you can tell that how much that people have been, how Angela Rayner has been thrust into positions that are not exactly the best optically because she's to the left wing and she can't be removed because she's not part of the little in-group at the Politburo at the top of the party. Look at all the remit she's been given. It's stuff that people don't like. The NIMBYs will hate her for building new towns. All of the people think, I mean, there will be some ecological damage if they have the private sector doing it. So this is true. Like the deregulation will lead to ecological damage that will be unwelcome to plenty of constituencies. They've given her the tear up of the councils and trying to revamp councils too. It does seem to me that they're trying to make Angela Rayner the bad guy in terms of the policy that they know is divisive. So whether or not that this means these new towns are going to come to fruition, I don't know. But unless we actually see some action in terms of putting shovels into the ground very, very soon, I think we'll have all of these plans fritter away into nothingness as they get booted out of power in 2029.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to see a lot of action from Inaction Man himself. And I have to say, if it wasn't my job, if I was just like an ordinary person I mean, I am an ordinary person, but if it wasn't my job to look at the news, I think every time I saw a headline with a Labour pledge or a Labour promise or some new policy announcement, I would just blank over it completely, just turn the page and, go to the celebrity pages. All right, Helena, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you all for watching. Come back tomorrow for another live show at 6 p.m. Until then, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.